The great hall of the Galactic Council floated high above the clouds. Its walls were made of clear glass and smooth silver metal. Outside, the sky was painted with slow-moving lights. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the sound of soft music and quiet chatter. Thousands of alien delegates wore bright robes and held crystal cups. They were celebrating. The long war against the chitin swarm was finally over. The council called it a perfect victory. Elias Vance stood near the back of the room. He wore a dark uniform with a single silver pin on his chest. The pin marked him as the human liaison. It was a title that sounded important, but it meant very little in practice. The council had not asked humans to plan the final attacks. They had not asked humans to lead the great fleets. They had only asked humans to watch, to nod, and to sign papers when the time came. Elias did not complain. He knew his place. He had learned it over 3 long years of blood and silence. He stood still and watched the room. He kept his hands at his sides. He kept his face calm. That was what was expected of him. A tall alien stepped onto the central platform. It was High Prelate Vale. His skin was pale blue and his voice carried through the hall without effort. He raised his glass. The room went quiet at once. Everyone turned to listen. Vale spoke of peace, of order, and of the bright future that lay ahead. He spoke of the enemy defeat. He spoke of the clean end to a dirty war. He did not speak of the cost. He did not speak of the millions who never came home. He did not speak of the long nights or the broken machines, or the names that would never be read aloud again. Elias kept his eyes on the holographic screens floating above the crowd. They showed maps of the outer systems. Green lines marked the new safe zones. Red zones marked the places the enemy had taken and then lost. The council called the red zones containment corridors. They were areas cleared for future trade and quiet rebuilding. But Elias knew what those red lines really covered. They covered the dry plains of Cinder 9. They covered the shattered valleys of Oakhaven Station. They covered the wide fields where human regiments had made their last stand. He had seen the reports. He had counted the names. He had signed the burial orders. He remembered the cold mornings on the front. He remembered the way the soldiers wrote letters they knew would never be sent. He remembered the sound of boots marching into the smoke, never marching out. Now, the council used a pretty name for the dirt that held his friends. "We have restored balance," Vale said. His voice was smooth and sure. "The enemy is broken. Their hive mind is silent. We will archive the casualty lists as statistical reconciliations. We will move forward." A soft cheer moved through the room. Glasses clinked together. Aliens smiled and bowed to one another. Elias felt a heavy weight in his chest. He did not reach for his own glass. He could not swallow the dry air in his throat. He looked down at his boots. They were polished for the ceremony, but he could still imagine the red dust of the front lines on them. He could still hear the sound of artillery in his mind. He could still see the faces of the soldiers who had trusted him to bring them back. They had not been brought back. They had been left behind so the war could end quickly. A small screen on his wrist chimed. It was a private message. He glanced at it. The text was short. It came from a forward observer near the Cinder 9 border. "Sensor readings are strange," the message read. "Bioresonance echoes in Sector 4. Ground movement matches old patrol patterns, requesting confirmation." Elias frowned. He tapped a reply, "Post-war sensor ghosting. Stand down." He sent the message and looked away. It was probably nothing. The ground on Cinder 9 was unstable. Old machines still sparked. Wind moved through broken metal. It was easy for sensors to make mistakes after so much fighting. The council had already declared the area safe. There was no reason to doubt them. But the numbers did not add up. The observer had sent 3 reports before this one. The first one mentioned low power surges. The second mentioned metal scraping against stone. The third mentioned shapes moving in the ash. Elias had marked them all as false alarms. He had told himself the same thing every time. It is just the wind. It is just broken wires. It is just the mind playing tricks after years of fear. Yet his hands felt cold. His gut felt tight. He knew the difference between bad sensors and real movement. He had spent too many years reading battlefields to be fooled by simple static. The music grew louder. Dancers in silk robes moved across the polished floor. Waiters offered trays of sweet drinks and glowing fruit. Elias turned his back on the feast. He walked toward the large doors at the edge of the hall. He moved slowly, keeping his steps quiet. No one noticed him leave. He was just another shadow in a room full of bright lights. That was how humans were seen here, useful for the hard work but quiet during the celebration. He stepped out onto a wide balcony. The air outside was cool and clean. The sky city hummed softly beneath his feet. Far below, the clouds drifted like slow rivers. Elias leaned against the metal railing. He closed his eyes and tried to breathe. The smell of sweet wine and alien perfume still clung to his uniform. He hated it. It felt like a lie. Victory was supposed to feel like relief. It was supposed to feel like rest. Instead, it felt like a door closing too fast. He opened his eyes and looked toward the dark horizon. Somewhere out there, past the trade routes and the patrol lines, lay the graves he had helped mark. Somewhere out there, the ground was still settling over broken armor and spent shells. He thought of the message on his wrist. He thought of the word echoes. He told himself it was just machine noise. He told himself the war was truly over. But deep in his chest, a quiet voice disagreed. It said the story had not finished. It said the dead do not like to be forgotten. It said the line they drew in the dirt was not a boundary. It was a promise. Elias straightened his back. He adjusted the silver pin on his chest. He would go back inside. He would nod at the right times. He would sign the papers they gave him, but he knew he would not rest. He would watch the reports. He would check the censors. He would wait for the truth to rise. The council had their celebration. They had their peace, but peace built on silence never lasts. And Elias Vance was a man who knew how to listen to the quiet. He turned and walked back toward the doors. The sound of the feast grew louder again. He did not hurry. He did not look back. He simply moved forward, carrying the weight of the war in his steps and the feeling that the earth was not as still as they claimed. The transport ship landed on Cinder 9 with a heavy thud. Dust rose in thick clouds around the landing struts. The ramp lowered slowly. Elias Vance stepped out into the cold air. The sky above was gray and heavy. The ground was covered in pale ash and broken metal. This was the memorial trenches. It was the place where the 7th Vanguard had made their last stand. Elias carried a small metal box in his hands. Inside was a single dog tag. It belonged to a young soldier named Cole. Elias had promised to bring it here. He had promised to lay it in the dirt where Cole fell. He walked forward alone. The council had allowed him to visit the site, but they had sent 2 armed guards to watch him. The guards stayed near the ship. They wore heavy armor and held pulse rifles. They did not like being here. The air felt wrong. It was too quiet. The wind moved through the wreckage with a low, hollow sound. Elias kept his head down. His boots sank into the soft ash with every step. He could still see the old trench lines. They were filled with broken glass, twisted wire, and the rusted shells of old machines. He stopped at a small marker. It was a simple metal post. He knelt and opened the box. He took out the tag. He held it for a moment. The metal was warm from his hands. He placed it gently on the ground. He pressed it into the dirt. He closed his eyes. He said a quiet word. He did not pray. He just remembered. Then the ground moved. It was not a quake. Elias knew the feel of a quake. This was different. It was a steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Like heavy boots striking stone, the ash around him began to shift. Small stones rolled downhill. Elias opened his eyes and stood up slowly. He looked at the trench line ahead. The dirt was rising. Plates of shattered armor pushed through the surface. Wires snapped free from the soil. Something was moving under the ash. Something was waking up. The guards near the ship shouted. They raised their rifles. Their voices cracked with fear. One of them called into his radio. The word plague echoed across the open ground. Necroplague. The guards backed away. Their hands shook. They pointed their weapons at the rising shapes. Elias did not move. He stood still and watched. The first figure broke through the ash. It wore a broken combat suit. The helmet was cracked. One arm hung loose at the shoulder. The chest plate was scorched black. It stood slowly as if learning how to balance again. Then another rose and another. They pulled themselves from the dirt. Dust fell from their armor. Wires sparked weakly. They did not run. They did not scream. They simply stood in a loose line, their heads turned toward the ridge. Their movements were stiff, but they were not random. They were steady. They were purposeful. Elias felt his heart beat faster. He knew this sight. He had seen it in old training files. He had read about it in classified reports, but he had never believed it would work. He stepped forward. The guards yelled at him to stop. He ignored them. He walked toward the risen figures. His wrist device chimed softly. A blue screen lit up. Text scrolled across the glass. LAZARUS directive. Post-vital neural scaffolding active. System check, nominal. Power reserve mode. Directive hold line. Secure SURVIVORS. Maintain perimeter. Elias stopped breathing for a second. The words brought back a cold memory. He was in a medical tent on a forward base. The air smelled of antiseptic and burnt wire. A doctor in a gray coat had handed him a data pad. The waiver was long. The language was dry. It spoke of emergency protocols. It spoke of neural mesh implants. It spoke of backup power cells woven into spinal armor. If vitals drop, if comms fail, if the command chain breaks, the mesh will carry the last order. It will keep the body moving. It will not let the mission die. Elias had signed it for himself. He had signed it for every soldier in the 7th Vanguard. They had known the risk. They had known the cost. They had signed anyway. They chose to fight until there was nothing left, not even a pulse. The lead figure turned its head. It looked at Elias. The cracked visor reflected the gray sky. Elias saw the number painted on the shoulder plate. 7V44, Sergeant Rourke. Elias felt a tight knot in his throat. He remembered Rourke's laugh. He remembered the way Rourke shared his water ration on hot days. He remembered the day Rourke fell, holding the blast door open so others could escape. Now Rourke stood again. His breathing system hissed with weak, broken sounds. His legs moved with slow, mechanical grace. He did not speak. He could not speak. The vocal cords were gone, but the suit carried the signal. The mesh carried the will. The figures did not attack. They moved past Elias. They walked toward a collapsed bunker down the slope. They worked in silence. 2 soldiers lifted a heavy steel beam. Another pulled a trapped medic from the rubble. They moved with a quiet rhythm. They checked the wreckage. They cleared the path. They formed a line facing the outer ridge. It was a perimeter. It was a wall. They were doing what they were told to do. They were protecting the ground. They were buying time. The guards lowered their rifles slightly. Their fear turned to confusion. One of them whispered, "What are they?" Elias did not look back. He kept his eyes on the line of soldiers. "They are still on duty," he said. His voice was low but clear. They never left their post. The wind picked up. It blew ash across the trench. The figures did not flinch. Their armor creaked. Their joints moved with soft clicks. Some of them dragged broken weapons. They placed them on the ridge. They set them to auto-fire. They checked the angles. They adjusted the sights. They were preparing for an attack that had not come yet, or maybe it had. Elias looked at the sky. The clouds were thinning. In the distance, a low hum echoed through the valley. It was not the wind. It was engines. Something was approaching. The swarm did not leave their dead alone. They sent scavengers. They sent hunters. They came to pick the bones of the battlefield. The risen soldiers turned toward the sound. Their stances shifted. They raised their weapons. The movement was slow, but it was exact. They did not panic. They did not run. They stood their ground. They were broken. They were empty, but they were still here. Elias felt a strange calm wash over him. The council had called this a victory. They had called the war over. But the ground told a different story. The war was not over. The line still held. The promise was still kept. He walked to the edge of the trench. He stood beside the fallen soldiers. He did not touch them. He did not give orders. He simply stood with them. He watched the horizon. He waited for the enemy to come. He knew the guards would call the council. He knew the scientists would panic. He knew the politicians would demand answers. But none of that mattered right now. Right now there was only the trench. There was only the ash. There was only the quiet duty of men and women who refused to let their brothers fall alone. The hum grew louder. Shadows moved against the gray light. The first wave was coming. The soldiers adjusted their grip. The mesh pulsed with weak blue light along their spines. Elias placed his hand on his own weapon. He checked the charge. He stood ready. He would not run. He would not hide. He would stand beside the dead. And together they would hold the line. The alarm sounded before Elias even left the trench. It was not the soft chime of a civilian alert. It was the sharp, repeating tone of a high-priority summons. His wrist screen flashed red. The Galactic Council demanded his immediate presence. He knew what it meant. The guards had sent their report. The images had traveled faster than light. The Council had seen the dead walk. They had seen the ash rise. They had seen humans return from the grave, and they were afraid. Elias took a transport back to the Sky City. The flight was short and silent. He did not speak to the pilot. He watched the clouds pass. He thought of the soldiers on the ridge. They were still standing. They were still watching the horizon. He hoped they would hold until he returned. He stepped off the transport into a cold, white corridor. 2 council guards met him. They did not offer words. They only pointed toward the central chamber. Elias walked forward. His boots made a steady sound on the smooth floor. He kept his face calm. He kept his hands empty. He was ready for anger. He was ready for orders. He was not ready to back down. The conclave hall was no longer a place of celebration. The soft music was gone. The bright lights were dimmed. The clear glass walls showed a dark sky. The alien delegates stood in tight groups. Their voices were low and fast. Fear moved through the room like a cold wind. When Elias entered, the talking stopped. Every eye turned to him. High Prelate Vale stood on the central platform. His blue skin looked pale in the dim light. His hands were clenched at his sides. "Liaison Vance," Vale said. His voice was tight. "You will explain this anomaly. You will explain why the dead walk on Cinder 9. You will explain why our sensors show movement where there should be only silence." Elias stepped forward. He did not bow. He placed his hands on the edge of the central console. He tapped his wrist device. A holographic screen lit up above the platform. Lines of data scrolled across the glass. Neural telemetry, power levels, movement logs, audio files. He pushed the feed to the main display. Every delegate saw it. "This is not an anomaly," Elias said. His voice was steady. "This is a protocol. It is called the Lazarus Directive. It is a human contingency. When soldiers fall in combat, their neural mesh does not shut down. It switches to reserve power. It keeps the muscles moving. It keeps the mission active. They are not cursed. They are not sick. They are following orders." He pointed to the screen. The data showed clear patterns. The risen soldiers were not wandering. They were clearing paths. They were pulling survivors from collapsed tunnels. They were retrieving command black boxes from wrecked ships. They were setting up relay towers, and they were broadcasting a steady signal. Elias isolated the audio file. He played it. A low, rhythmic pulse filled the room. It matched the known frequency of the chitin swarm hive network. "They are tracking enemy movement," Elias continued. "They are mapping the swarm patterns. They are sending the data to our forward stations. They are holding the line so civilian transports can leave the sector. They are buying us time." Vale stepped closer to the screen. His eyes narrowed. "Time for what?" he asked. "The war is over. The swarm is broken." Elias looked at him. "The war is not over," he said. "You declared victory too soon. You pulled your fleets back. You called the outer belt safe, but you did not check the deep scan. You did not look past the asteroid ring. The primary swarm queen is still alive. She is regrouping. She is waiting. And when she moves, your peace will end in fire." A heavy silence fell over the room. Delegates shifted in their seats. Some whispered. Others stared at the floor. Vale's jaw tightened. "You are making a serious claim," he said. "I am showing you the data," Elias replied. "The dead are broadcasting hive frequencies. They are tracking fleet formations. They are reading the swarm's next move. If you ignore this, you will lose everything. If you purge the sector, you will destroy the only warning system we have. You will leave the outer colonies blind." Vale turned away from the screen. He spoke to the High Command. "We cannot allow an uncontrolled bioresonance to spread. If the neural mesh reaches orbital infrastructure, it could corrupt our networks. It could breach our defense grids. We must glass the sector. We must burn the anomaly from orbit. Clean and final." Murmurs of agreement rose from the delegates. Glassing the sector was an old tactic. It meant dropping high-yield warheads from orbit. It meant turning the ground to molten glass. It would erase the dead. It would erase the data. It would erase the warning. It would also erase the survivors still hiding in the trenches. It would erase the black boxes. It would erase the chance to prepare. Elias stepped back from the console. His voice cut through the room. "No." The word was quiet, but it carried. Vale turned slowly. "You will follow council orders," he said. "You are a liaison. You do not command. You do not decide." "I am a soldier," Elias said, "and I will not stand by while you burn the men and women who kept you safe. You declared peace. You signed the papers. You raised your glasses, but we are still fighting the war you forgot. You left them there. You left them to hold the ground. And they did. They are still doing it. I will not let you erase their duty. I will not let you erase their names." Vale's eyes hardened. "Then you are in direct defiance. Your clearance will be revoked. You will be confined until this matter is resolved." Elias did not move. He reached to his belt. He unclipped his comm badge. He placed it on the console. He pulled up his armor schematic on his wrist screen. "I'm requesting field clearance," he said. "I'm requesting authorization to interface with the Lazarus mesh. I will link my neural system to the relay. I will take command of the perimeter. I will coordinate the defense. I will hold the line until the civilian ships clear the sector. You can lock me out later. You can court-martial me. You can strip my rank, but you will not fire on my people, not while I stand between you and them." The room was silent. The delegates watched him. They saw the calm in his face. They saw the steady hands. They saw the weight of years of war in his eyes. Vale looked at the High Command. They exchanged quiet words. The data on the screen still pulsed. The swarm frequency still echoed. The truth was hard to ignore. The dead were working. The dead were warning them. The dead were holding back the dark. Vale finally spoke. "You have one standard hour. If the mesh shows signs of corruption, if the signal turns hostile, we will override your link and fire. You will be responsible for every life lost." "I accept," Elias said. He turned and walked out of the hall. The guards did not stop him. They stepped aside. He moved quickly down the corridor. His mind was already working. He needed his suit. He needed the interface rig. He needed to get back to Cinder 9 before the swarm vanguard arrived. He entered the armory alone. The lights flickered on. Rows of armor stood in silent lines. He walked to the heavy combat frame marked with his call sign. He opened the chest plate. He pulled out the neural harness. It was a thin web of silver wire and soft pads. It connected to the spine. It linked to the brain. It was dangerous. It was untested at this range. It was his only chance. He stripped off his uniform. He stepped into the suit. The armor closed around him with a series of soft clicks. The helmet sealed with a hiss. The internal screens lit up. Power levels rose. Systems checked out. He attached the harness to the port at the base of his neck. A cold sensation spread through his back. His vision shifted. Data streams flowed across his helmet display. He felt the hum of the suit. He felt the pull of the distant mesh. It was weak. It was tired, but it was there. It was waiting for a voice. It was waiting for a node. He stepped toward the launch bay. The doors opened. The wind howled outside. He did not hesitate. He walked forward. He carried the weight of the living and the dead. He carried the promise of the trench. He was not going to a celebration. He was going back to the fight. And this time he would not watch from the back. He would stand at the front. He would link the chain. He would make sure the line held. The council had their fear. He had his fidelity. And fidelity does not break. It only endures. The dropship cut through the thick gray clouds. Alarms sounded inside the small cabin. The metal walls shook hard as the ship hit the heavy air. Elias sat in the rear seat. His combat armor was locked tight around his body. The neural harness pressed against the base of his neck. The pilot did not speak. The ship had only one job. It was to drop him near the trench and fly away fast. The back ramp opened before the ship touched the ground. Cold wind and pale ash filled the cabin. Elias stood. He did not wait. He stepped out into the open sky. His heavy boots hit the hard dirt. The ship lifted fast and disappeared into the clouds. He was alone on the ridge. He knelt down. He pressed 2 fingers against the control panel on his wrist. The screen showed a single word: Link. He took a slow breath. He pressed the button. A sharp cold shot through his spine. His vision went white. Then it went dark. Then it filled with light. Feelings filled his head. Not words, not clear voices. Memories and sensations. The smell of rain on hot metal, the weight of a heavy rifle, the sound of a friend calling his name, the sharp bite of shrapnel, the quiet order to hold the door. The pain was there, but it was dull. It was wrapped in a thick blanket of calm. The neural mesh was working. It was bridging his mind to theirs. He felt the dirt under his knees, but he also felt the dirt under 300 other pairs of boots. He felt the wind on his face, but he also felt the wind on cracked visors across the valley. He was not alone. He was part of a chain. He opened his eyes. The world looked different. Lines of data floated in the air. Red marks showed enemy approach paths. Blue marks showed friendly positions. He turned his head. A figure stood 10 paces away. The armor was broken. The helmet was scarred. The number on the shoulder read 7-44, Sergeant Rourke. The soldier did not move. He did not speak. But in Elias' mind a clear signal arrived. Ready. It was not a word. It was a state of being, a quiet promise. I am not here to lead you, Elias thought. The mesh carried the thought. It spread through the network like a ripple in still water. I am here to connect. I am here to make the signal stronger. Show me what you see. The ground shook. The sound came from above. Elias looked up. The clouds parted. Dark shapes fell through the sky. Swarm dropped pods. They burned as they dropped. They hit the ground in wide circles. The ash flew up in tall waves. Metal doors blew open. Chitinous forms crawled out. They moved fast. They moved in packs. Their claws clicked against the stone. Their eyes glowed with a pale green light. The vanguard had arrived. The fallen soldiers did not panic. They moved with slow, exact steps. They took cover behind broken walls. They set their heavy rifles on the rocks. They checked their ammo counts. They lined up their shots. The mesh carried their plans to Elias. He saw it all at once. Fire lanes overlapped. Kill zones crossed. Blind spots were covered by 2 or 3 weapons. They had done this before. They had done it in life. They were doing it now in death. Elias raised his own rifle. He did not aim at a single target. He aimed at the mesh relay tower on the ridge. He fired a short burst. The energy hit the control box. Sparks flew. The tower hummed. A signal shot into the sky. It hit the old orbital defense grid. The grid had been left broken by the Council retreat, but the dead had spent weeks fixing the wires. They had rerouted the power. They had aligned the dishes. Now the signal woke them up. High above, silent guns turned. They locked onto the swarm dropships. They waited for the order. The swarm charged. They ran up the slope. They did not use cover. They did not care about the fire. They only cared about breaking the line. The first volley hit them. Blue tracer rounds cut through the air. Chitin shattered. Black fluid sprayed the ash. The fallen soldiers fired in steady rhythm. One shot. Pause. One shot. Pause. No wasted movement, no panic, just math and muscle memory. Elias fired with them. His suit tracked the targets. The mesh shared his aim. Every shot he took was mirrored by a dozen others. The hillside lit up with muzzle flash and smoke. The swarm pushed harder. They climbed over the dead of their own kind. They reached the first line of cover. A fallen soldier stood up. He did not run. He threw a heavy charge. It hit the center of the pack. The blast threw bodies into the air. The soldier fell back. His armor was torn. His left arm was gone, but he kept firing with his right hand. The mesh carried his status to Elias. Power low, structural damage critical, mission hold, no retreat. Elias felt the weight of it. It was not fear. It was duty, pure and simple. High above, the Council ships held position. Their sensors tracked the battle. Their weapons were hot. Their commanders watched the screens. They saw the dead fighting. They saw the swarm breaking against the line. They saw a human standing with them, sharing their burden. The council pilots hesitated. They had been told the mesh was a plague. They had been told it was a corruption. But the data told a different story. The dead were not attacking them. They were protecting them. They were holding back the dark so the living could live. The commanders did not fire. They could not find a reason to pull the trigger. The sight broke their training. It left them silent. They watched with wide eyes as humans and fallen humans fought as one. Back on the ground, the fight grew tight. The swarm changed tactics. They dug into the ash. They flanked the ridge. They tried to slip through the gaps. The mesh adjusted instantly. Elias felt the shift. He sent a command through the network. Shift fire left. Cover the low path. Trigger secondary mines. The fallen soldiers moved. They did not speak. They simply turned their weapons. They fired into the new path. Hidden charges blew under the ash. The flank collapsed. The swarm fell back for a moment. Then they charged again. Elias' armor warning flashed. Heat levels rising. Ammo at 40%. His muscles ached. The neural link pulled at his mind. It wanted him to push harder. It wanted him to give more. He let it. He did not fight the drain. He fed it his focus. He fed it his will. He remembered the faces on the memorial wall. He remembered the names on the dog tags. He remembered the promise to bring them home. They were already home. They were standing on the dirt. They were holding the line. He would not let them fall twice. The swarm queen's signal grew loud in the mesh. It was a harsh, grinding noise. It tried to break their coordination. It tried to turn the dead against each other. The mesh rejected it. Human code did not bend to hive commands. It was built on trust. It was built on shared pain. It was built on the simple truth that a soldier does not leave a brother behind. The queen's signal bounced off the network like rain on glass. The dead kept firing. The line did not move. Elias fired his last heavy round. He dropped the empty rifle. He drew his sidearm. He stepped forward. He stood beside Rourke. The sergeant's helmet was cracked open. One eye glowed with a faint blue light. He looked at Elias. He gave a single nod. The mesh carried the feeling, respect, relief, resolve. Elias nodded back. He raised his pistol. He fired at the next wave. The sound of the weapon was lost in the roar of the battle, but the aim was true. The line held. The ground shook. The sky burned. But the dead did not break, and neither did the living. They stood together in the ash, two halves of the same promise, and they waited for the end of the push. The fight was not over, but the line would not fall. Not today, not ever. The mesh hummed. The weapons fired. The earth held. And above the smoke, the silent guns of the old grid turned toward the sky, ready for the final strike. The wait was almost done. The line would hold until it was, and it would hold together, always. The sky darkened with heavy ships. Council dropships broke through the gray clouds. Their engines roared with a deep, vibrating hum. Their bellies opened to reveal rows of heavy bombs. They carried purge ordnance. They carried fire meant to burn the trench clean. The order had been given. The sector was to be erased. Elias stood on the ridge. He did not raise his weapon. He did not run for cover. He stood in the open. He turned his face to the sky. He tapped his wrist console. He switched his neural link to broadcast mode. He sent the raw feed to every channel. Civilian networks, military bands, public archives. The galaxy would see what the council refused to watch. The data flowed out like a river. It showed the truth without hiding anything. It showed the fallen soldiers moving civilian transports to safety. It showed them clearing heavy rubble from collapsed tunnels. It showed them standing in open fields, drawing enemy fire so medical teams could retreat. It showed them reciting evacuation codes through broken speakers. It showed them holding a line with broken bodies and quiet minds. The signal reached the outer colonies. It reached the busy trade stations. It reached the quiet homes of families who had lost children to the war. Millions watched the screens. Millions saw the dead not as monsters but as shields. The council pilots hesitated in their cockpits. Their fingers hovered over release triggers. The bombs stayed in their racks. The sky ships hung in the air, caught between strict orders and a sudden, heavy conscience. Then the true enemy arrived. The space above the valley tore open. A massive swarm carrier dropped from high orbit. It was black and jagged, it moved like a falling mountain. The Queen's personal fleet followed close behind. Smaller ships swarmed around it like angry insects. They poured fighters into the atmosphere. The ground shook hard. The ash rose in thick, choking waves. The fallen soldiers turned as one. They did not look up in fear. They adjusted their aim. They checked their remaining power cells. They shifted their weight into the hard dirt. The mesh pulsed with a steady blue rhythm. It carried the final command. Hold, protect, wait for the strike. Elias stood at the center. His armor was scorched and cracked. His main rifle was empty. His sidearm had no charge left, but the link was strong. He felt their calm. He felt their focus. He opened the orbital targeting channel. The old defense grid had been waiting for this exact moment. The dead had spent weeks aligning the dishes. They had mapped the Queen's movement patterns. They had calculated the exact window for a clean strike. Elias fed the final coordinates into the system. He locked the target. He sent the fire command. High above, silent lances woke up. They drew power from the dead grid. They aimed at the center of the swarm fleet. They fired. Beams of white light cut through the sky. They moved faster than sound. They struck the swarm carrier with terrible force. The hull cracked open. Fire poured out into the cold air. The Queen's signal screamed across the network. It was a sound of rage and sudden silence. The carrier broke apart. Heavy debris fell like rain. The smaller ships lost their guidance. They spun out of control. They crashed into the valley walls. The swarm line broke completely. The charge stopped. The valley fell into a heavy, ringing quiet. The war was truly over this time. The Council dropships lowered their ramp guns. Their engines powered down to a low idle. The purge ordnance remained locked away. The High Command had seen enough. The data had spoken clearly. The dead had saved them. They had saved the outer colonies. They had saved the peace the Council thought they won alone. A single transport ship landed near the ridge. The ramp lowered slowly. High Prelate Vale stepped out. He wore scorched armor. His face was pale. His hands were empty. He walked slowly through the ash. He stopped a few paces from Elias. He looked at the line of fallen soldiers. He looked at the broken armor. He looked at the quiet figures standing in the dust. His voice was soft, stripped of all its old pride. "What are they?" he asked. Elias turned to him. His helmet was off. His face was tired. His eyes were clear. He looked at the soldiers. He looked at the sky. He looked back at Vale. "They are ours," he said. The words were simple. They carried the weight of 1,000 graves. They carried the truth of a people who do not forget. Vale nodded slowly. He did not argue. He did not command. He simply stood in the ash and watched. The neural mesh began to fade. The reserve power was finally spent. The blue light along the spines dimmed to nothing. The steady hum grew quiet. The soldiers did not fall. They did not collapse. They moved with slow, careful grace. They lowered their weapons. They stepped back from the ridge. One by one, they knelt in the dirt. It was not a surrender, it was a rest. The mesh released its hold. The quiet returned to the valley. Elias walked to the front of the line. He stopped beside Sergeant Rourke. The cracked visor reflected the pale sky. The blue light in the helmet faded to gray. Elias placed his hand on the scarred chest plate. The metal was cold. The silence was deep. "Mission complete," he said. His voice was low, but it carried across the still valley. The sun broke through the clouds. It shone on the ash. It shone on the broken armor. It shone on the quiet ridge. The wind moved gently now. It did not howl. It did not carry smoke. It carried the sound of distant ships leaving orbit. It carried the sound of a war finally ending. The Council transport lifted off. It did not fire. It did not drop bombs. It flew toward the Sky City carrying a new report. The report would change everything. In the months that followed, the galaxy learned to read the old data differently. They learned the Lazarus Directive was not a weapon. It was a covenant. They learned that humans did not fear death. They honored it. They carried it. They used it to protect the living. The Council drafted the first accords of post-vital recognition. It was a simple document. It stated that those who served would not be erased. It stated that their duty would be recorded. It stated that their sacrifice would be remembered, not buried. The alien delegates signed it without protest. They had seen the ridge. They had felt the truth. Fear had turned to respect. Elias Vance never wore the liaison pin again. He wore a simple coat. He worked on the memorial grounds. He tended the markers. He read the names aloud. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, he would stand on the ridge and listen to the wind. He did not expect the ground to move. He did not wait for signals. He just remembered. He knew the dead were not gone. They were at rest. They had held the line. They had kept the promise. And because they did, the living could breathe. The galaxy was safe. Not by weapons, not by treaties, but by the quiet, unbroken loyalty of those who refused to leave their post, even when their hearts stopped beating. The story did not end in fire. It ended in peace, and peace at last was earned.